but I don't have time. I have all this paperwork to do during the weekends. I don't have time. And I really didn't have time. And she told me, there is always somebody who is busier than you are, yet they have found time for self-care and relaxation. So you have no excuse. Have you ever wondered why sometimes you're able to cope with stress perfectly and other times you're not? The best way to understand how stress works is by imagining that you're carrying a bucket with you at all times. This bucket, slowly but surely, fills up with water every time you experience stressful events, meaning that it fills up with stress. Having work-related issues, for example, add water to the bucket. Financial difficulties, add some more. Health worries, add water. Conflict with your spouse, more water. Your bucket fills up with all the stresses you experience in a day. And if you don't do something to empty it, the water level will eventually raise over the top of the bucket. At this point, even a small thing can tip it over. A mild trigger, such as a comment somebody makes about your work, can make you much more overwhelmed and reactive than usual. And those around you might think that you're overreacting, that you're being emotional for no reason. But that's because they can't see inside your bucket, can they? They don't know everything else you've been dealing with before this moment. So how do we prevent our buckets from overflowing? We empty them. We let the stress out by using a tab called helpful coping. This tab represents self-care activities you do on a regular basis in order to prevent the water from building up. But there is another tab on the bucket. It's called unhelpful coping or recycled stress. These are things we do which bring us relief in the short term, but actually make things worse for us in the long run. They bring the water back to the bucket and therefore making it more likely to overflow. I will show you what those are in just a few minutes. So what we want to do moving forward is not to use the unhelpful coping tab anymore. Instead, we would start using the helpful one only. And we're going to do that regularly. That's the definition of self-care. Knowing what would bring you long-term benefit and choosing it over short-term relief. Because short-term relief is recycled stress, and you don't need that. Have you ever wondered why some people are handling stress better? My bet is that they're very good at emptying their buckets. They engage in healthy activities, which prevents their stress from building up. I'm never going to forget this. This is a side note. The first supervisor I had at the beginning when I started doing therapy, I was working full time. I was really being stressed at the beginning. And she told me to take a couple of days off, try to relax, try to, collect myself again. And I told her, but I don't have time. I have all this paperwork to do during the weekends. I don't have time. And I really didn't have time. And she told me, there is always somebody who is busier than you are, yet they have found time for self-care and relaxation. So you have no excuse. This is something I'm probably going to remember for the rest of my life. It changed my perspective that if we don't recharge our batteries, who's going to do that for us? Nobody. It's our responsibility. It's also useful to mention that everybody's bucket size is different, right? So your bucket may be bigger than mine. You may have a capacity to hold more water. The bucket may have a capacity to hold more water. So you would need quite a lot of stressors to fill it up, whereas I may only need a few to reach the overflowing point. And this depends on many factors, such as how much resilience we have, how vulnerable we are, what our personality traits are, what our genetics are, but regardless of the size of our buckets. They would get close to the limits of what they can hold if water keeps being poured into them without being let out. So let's dive into the recycle stress first and learn what the most common unhelpful activities are, so that we reduce that water, we get rid of that water that gets back to the bucket. In the first part of this class, we talked about the behavioral symptoms of stress, which trick us into thinking that they're helpful, but in reality make things worse for us. As you can see in the picture, those unhelpful behaviors contribute to recycled stress. And what do we mean by recycled? Well, they provide us with short-term relief, but cause us more trouble in the long run. They don't solve the problem. They actually keep it going and even make it worse sometimes. I'm going to introduce you to the most common unhelpful coping mechanisms now, and I'd like you to think about whether you use any of those activities. Think about your own experience. How do you deal with stress? Do you use any of those activities to cope with it? Hopefully, by seeing them on this list, you would start associating them not so much with relief, but with a problem in the long term. This will help you be mindful of your actions moving forward in choosing helpful activities rather than unhelpful ones. Because again, that's called self-care. The first one is caffeine overconsumption. Caffeine is a stimulant which provides us with energy to be productive, to accomplish our tasks, to work until 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. on a daily basis, and having an occasional cup of coffee is considered to be harmless. However, it's good to know that caffeine has lasting effects on the body. Did you know that the average half-life of caffeine for a healthy adult is 5 to 6 hours? It makes us alert, it makes us energetic in the short term because it increases our adrenaline levels. It also makes us feel better because it increases our dopamine levels. But after the initial high wears off, we could start feeling low, agitated, and even more stressed than before. So please be mindful of how much coffee you drink on a daily basis and try not to use it as a tool for coping with stress. A great tip to remember is to avoid drinking coffee after 1 p.m. because, as we said earlier, caffeine stays in your system for several hours. And this can disrupt your sleep. And lack of sleep is another factor that can contribute to increased stress levels. We don't want that chain reaction to happen. Next, we have alcohol consumption. Do you unwind with a glass of wine? Many people believe that alcohol is an amazing stress reliever. But similarly to caffeine, alcohol tends to have short-term benefits. And once its effect wears off, we might feel even more stressed and anxious than before. Also, it's useful to mention that long-term heavy drinking can actually alter the brain's chemistry and change the way we perceive and react to stressors. So please try to limit your alcohol intake and not to use it as a tool for coping with stress. Smoking and drugs is the next one, and there are so many health risks associated with both smoking and taking drugs, which is something I'm not going to go into detail about because the same principle applies here as well. Cigarettes and drugs seem like the best thing to do in the moment in situations where we feel overwhelmed, but they can lead to more stress once the high wears off. These are not long-term stress relievers. They temporarily make us feel good, but in the long term, they keep the problem going. And you may want to seek professional help if that's something you're having difficulty quitting. Next one is overeating and undereating. I'd like to say that probably everyone has done this at some point in their lives, but we don't have the evidence to assume that. We don't have the proof, so it's safe to say many of us. So let's start with many of us. Many of us turn to food to elevate our mood. Many of us turn to food to relieve stress or to reward ourselves for something we may have accomplished during the day. And we refer to that as Emotional eating or eating your feelings. So when we use food as a way of coping with unpleasant emotions. As you can imagine, consuming a high calorie, a high sugar, a high fat comfort food does not solve our stress problem. It temporarily improves our mood, yes, but few hours later, when the glucose level crash, we may start to feel not only stress, but also guilt, regret, and shame. Poor dietary choices have effects on our bodies too. They can lead to bloating, constipation, weight gain, and chronic tiredness. So essentially, by overeating, we're adding more challenges to our plates. Now, loss of appetite, as we said earlier, is another symptom of stress, and not eating enough is also problematic. It can lead to tiredness, difficulty concentrating, fatigue, and mood swings. When it comes to sleep in terms of stress, we can either sleep too much or too little. It's useful to remember that the Sleep Foundation recommends sleeping between 7 to 9 hours a day. Interestingly though, research suggests that the more time we spend sleeping, the more tired we tend to feel. And when you really think about it, if we feel tired, this makes it hard for us to recognize our stressors, to deal with them effectively, to be productive at work. And not being productive at work could be another stressor. And oversleeping is linked to a number of health risks as well, such as risk of obesity, diabetes. And undereating is linked to concentration difficulties, memory loss, stress, and anxiety. So it's very important for you to be mindful of your sleeping routine and to build healthy sleeping habits. Overworking is an interesting one. Have you ever said to yourself in times of stress, I'm just going to work harder now. This will make me feel much better. Does it? And for how long? Overworking is another stressor that keeps the problem going. Remember that the more tired we are, the more likely we are to make mistakes. Because we have difficulty concentrating and being productive. It's normal. And making mistakes leads to what? More stress. So overworking is not the solution. It's actually one of the most frequently reported causes of stress. What can we do instead? Working smarter, not harder, as they say. Taking care of our well-being while pursuing our career goals. Focusing on prioritizing our work, using our time wisely, avoiding multitasking, having regular small breaks between tasks, even if that break is just 30 seconds or 1 minute. And it might also be useful to set healthy working boundaries as part of your self-care plan. So this could be having regular lunch breaks, leaving work on time, making a rule not to check your email or phone in the evening. Social withdrawal is the next one, and it's a big one. How many of you cancel plans with friends and family when stressed? Has that ever happened to you? You feel stressed, so you cancel. This could actually be healthy and beneficial if you truly use that time to unwind and relax and engage in self-care. But oftentimes, when we avoid social contact due to stress, we don't engage in self-care. We don't use that time to recharge our batteries. Instead, what we do is engage in the unhelpful coping mechanisms we've been talking about. Here is an interesting fact. Prolonged social withdrawal can actually lead to depression. And this is because we deprive ourselves from all the positive emotions that come out of being around others. The pleasurable activities we do with friends and family help us not only to laugh and relax, but they also make us feel appreciated, supported, and loved. And these are important feelings we need in order to feel happy. Procrastination is the next one, and neglecting responsibilities, and it also makes perfect sense in the short term. So our minds and bodies are tired, so we think that not doing the tasks we're supposed to be doing would give us significant time to relax. But interestingly, this often leads to more stress. Why? Because during the time we're supposed to be relaxing, we keep thinking about all those important tasks we delayed doing. And this builds up pressure. This builds up stress. And can even make us feel disappointed in ourselves that we didn't do them in the first place. So please remember that if a task is truly important to you, let's say it's important for your career or for your relationship, your mind would not let you forget about it once you delay doing it. It will keep reminding you that you have to complete it. So the sooner you do it, the sooner you will relieve a great portion of your stress. So procrastination and neglecting responsibilities is not helpful at all. And lastly, ignoring the problem altogether. Most of those unhelpful things we do to cope with stress that we've just discussed are a way of avoiding dealing with the problem. The longer we avoid it, the longer it will stay with us. Remember that avoidance doesn't make something disappear. So sweeping stress under the rug, hoping that it will improve on its own, is not a realistic expectation. Of course, that could happen if a stressor is removed from our environment. So let's say, again, my main stress source could be workplace conflict, or let's say workplace conflict. If that conflict is resolved, sure, I may not experience any stress. But for many of us, this is not possible. We don't have control over that. We can't remove this particular stressor from our environment, or at least not now. So the only thing we do have control over is how we respond to that stressor. Taking control of the situation by making helpful plan of action. To take care of our feelings, to engage in emotional, physical, practical self-care that we'll be discussing shortly. And taking care of your actions is so empowering. Because this is actually one of the few things we have control over in this world. How we react and what we do with the challenges thrown at us. So as you can see, the common property of all of those unhelpful stress coping mechanisms is that they make perfect sense in the short term. They make us feel more relaxed, but in the long term, they keep stress going and actually make it worse sometimes. The more we engage in them, the more trapped we can get into the vicious stress cycle. So a great portion of your self-care plan would be recognizing your own unhelpful actions and substituting them with helpful ones. Let's have a look at the helpful ones right now. This is going to be a long list of self-care ideas. I'm sure everything we've discussed so far, especially the stress bucket, helped you realize the importance of self-care. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about this before I present you with the list of self-care ideas. Many of us have so many responsibilities on a daily basis that we forget to pay attention to what's happening within us, within our minds and bodies. So we focus on work, we focus on others, on their demands, on their wishes, on their needs. And there is nothing wrong with that, as long as there is a balance. As long as we are regularly checking in with ourselves and making sure that we're not neglecting our own personal needs. And self-care helps us create this balance. It's a rather broad term that basically means taking as much good care of you as you would take of the people you care about. Being as kind to yourself as you would be to others. And just the fact that you're here now watching this class means that you're already taking steps towards taking a good care of yourself, of your well-being and mental health. Given the lack of control we often have over our stress sources, as we said earlier, we may be having triggers which we are unable to control, which we are unable to remove from our environment, or at least not now. What we do have control over is how we respond to them. So given the lack of control we have over those stress sources, the goal of establishing a regular self-care routine is to keep your stress levels within the optimal range and maximize the likelihood of living a healthy life. In our terms, this means letting the water out of your bucket, eliminating it through the helpful coping tap frequently, so that it does not overflow, so that you don't become overwhelmed with stress. And practicing self-care frequently has long-term benefits for your mind and body. So tackling stress would not be the only benefit you would get out of it. It's been shown to prevent burnout, to increase productivity, to build emotional resilience, to even improve resistance to diseases, and to enhance self-confidence. Needless to say, self-care should be on your priorities list. Now, the easiest thing for me to say right now would be just practice self-care by exercising, eating well, and doing things you enjoy doing. But I actually want to give you more options, more ideas, list of things you can choose from, which would all contribute to you establishing a healthy self-care routine. Also, I don't know if you know this, but there are 6 types of self-care. These are emotional, physical, practical, social, mental, and spiritual. I'm going to share with you what each of those are and how they can help you. And I'm also going to give you specific self-care ideas within each category. Those are included in your workbook as well, so you don't need to write things down now. You'll be able to select your top picks on the workbook.